Today, we're jumping into a really fascinating and, for some, a pretty controversial take on biblical prophecy. We're going to explore this idea that the key to unlocking the end times isn't just buried in the prophetic books themselves, but it's actually hidden in plain sight, coded into an ancient feast. So, what is this hidden code? Let's get into it. I'm sure most of you know this verse. It's one of the most famous passages in the New Testament. It talks about this huge, dramatic moment in the future, all kicked off by the last trumpet. It's an incredible image, but honestly, what it actually means can feel pretty mysterious. And that right there is the million-dollar question. Was this just a cool-sounding poetic phrase, or did those words, the last trumpet, mean something very, very specific to the people who first heard them? That's the puzzle we're going to try and solve today. And what's so interesting is that the last trumpet isn't a one-off. The New Testament is packed with this kind of language that sounds, well, kind of like code. You've got phrases like those who sleep when talking about people who've died, or John seeing a door open in heaven, or the books were opened. What if these aren't just metaphors? The interpretation we're digging into today makes a really bold claim. It says this isn't poetry, it's a technical vocabulary. The idea is that for the apostles and the early believers, these phrases were part of a single, unified language, a code. And the key to that code has been, for the most part, overlooked. So what's the key? How do we crack this code? According to this theory, it all comes down to one ancient biblical feast, Yom Teruah, the Day of Trumpets. It's commanded way back in the Torah as a day for a sacred gathering, and you guessed it, for sounding trumpets. This, the argument goes, is our Rosetta Stone. Now, to really get this, you have to know that this one day has a bunch of different names, and each one peels back another layer of meaning. It's also called the Day of Judgment, the Day of Remembrance, and even the Day of the Throne. And here's the kicker. This interpretation says every single one of those names connects directly to a major end times theme in the New Testament. So here's the crucial point. The idea is that when the New Testament writers talked about resurrection or judgment or a king taking his throne, they weren't just being poetic. They were deliberately using the language of Yom Teruah to point their audience to its specific themes and even its timing. Let's start connecting the dots. In Ephesians, you've got this call to awake, you who sleep. Now, on the surface, that just sounds like a nice bit of spiritual encouragement, right? But it's actually a direct echo of verses from the prophet Isaiah. And guess when those specific verses are traditionally read aloud in synagogues? On Yom Teruah. Because they're all about the resurrection of the dead. Let's try another one. That famous, pretty intense scene in Revelation where the books were opened for judgment. Well, one of Yom Teruah's other names is Yom Hadin, which literally means the Day of Judgment. Jewish tradition holds that this is the exact day when the heavenly books are opened. Okay, what about the idea of being sealed? In Ephesians, it says believers are sealed with the Holy Spirit. We'll check this out. In Jewish tradition, the judgment that starts on Yom Teruah finishes 10 days later on Yom Kippur. And it's said that a person's fate is written in the books on Yom Teruah, but it's sealed on Yom Kippur. It's the exact same vocabulary. And the door standing open in heaven from Revelation, the connection here is just as direct. Yom Teruah is traditionally known as the day the gates of heaven are thrown open for judgment. And when are those gates closed? 10 days later, at the end of Yom Kippur. The parallels are just stacking up. This brings us to a really key verse. John says his epic vision started on the Lord's day, and the first thing he heard was a trumpet. Now, for hundreds of years, pretty much everyone has just read that and thought, oh, the Lord's day, that means Sunday. But what if that's a mistake? This interpretation argues that for a first-century Jew like John, the day of the Lord wasn't a day of the week at all. It was a well-known technical term for the great prophetic time of judgment, a time that always begins with the trumpet blast of Yom Teruah. So, if all these connections are intentional, what's the bigger picture they're painting? Well, the theory suggests it's not just about one day. It's about a very specific sequence of events, all symbolized by 3 great trumpet blasts, or shofars. This interpretation leans on a rabbinic tradition about 3 distinct, super significant shofar blasts. You have the first shofar, which sounded at Mount Sinai. Then you have the last shofar, which is tied to Yom Teruah and the resurrection. And finally, you have the great shofar, which is connected to Yom Kippur and the final gathering of God's people. And this is what could completely reframe the whole puzzle. If this three-part structure is the real blueprint, then the last trumpet in the New Testament isn't the final sound in all of history. No, it's a technical term for the second act in a three-act play, the resurrection of the dead, happening on a future Yom Teruah. So what's the number one thing to take away from all this? It's the core idea that this isn't just a handful of interesting coincidences. The argument is that the New Testament writers were all on the same page, consistently using one unified prophetic dictionary, and that dictionary was the biblical feasts. When you boil it all down, the whole thesis is this. The biblical feasts, especially the fall feasts, like Yom Teruah, were never meant to just be dusty old holidays we look back on. According to this view, they are a divine pattern, a prophetic blueprint that actually lays out the sequence of events for the future. Now, this is a pretty compelling, if unconventional, way to look at everything, and it leaves us with a huge, thought-provoking question. If this theory is right, if an ancient ritual is really the key to decoding these texts, then what other meanings have we missed? What other secrets might be waiting, hidden in plain sight, ready to be unlocked?